He slid the gift across her desk like it was nothing. No warning, no explanation. Just a man in a tailored charcoal suit who didn't belong in the building, who smiled the way men smile when they already know they've won, and set down a package wrapped in burgundy silk ribbon directly on top of Naomi Carter's afternoon filing stack. He didn't knock. He didn't ask. He simply looked at her with dark, calculating eyes and said, "Make sure you open it when you're alone." Then he walked out. Naomi sat frozen for 3 full seconds, coffee mug halfway to her mouth, watching the door swing shut behind a stranger who moved like he owned every room he'd ever entered. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't know what was inside that package. She had no idea that in roughly 40 minutes, the most feared Korean mafia boss in Chicago was going to walk through that same door, see that ribbon on her desk, and completely lose his composure for the first time in 7 years. All she knew, sitting there with her coffee going cold, was that something had just shifted, and not in a good direction. If you've ever worked somewhere you didn't quite fit, somewhere you showed up every day and did your job better than anyone around you and still somehow felt like you were one wrong move from being erased, then drop your city in the comments right now. Tell me where you're watching from. Because this story is about a woman who was invisible until the moment she became essential, and I need you with me until the very end. Like this video if you stayed past the first minute. Subscribe if you want to know how it ends. And whatever you do, don't go anywhere. Because what happened next inside Kang Min-jae's office changed everything. Naomi Carter had worked for Kang Min-jae for exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. She knew the count not because she was sentimental about it, but because she kept a small spiral notebook in her bottom drawer where she logged things, dates, discrepancies, anything that felt even slightly off in the daily operation of what was officially registered as KM Logistics and Import, a mid-size freight coordination company with offices on the 14th floor of a glass building in the West Loop. The notebook had nothing to do with sentiment. It had everything to do with survival. She'd learned early that in this particular office, the details everyone else dismissed were the ones that mattered most. A shipment manifest that listed 12 pallets instead of 11. A conference room booking that disappeared from the shared calendar 20 minutes after it appeared. A visitor who signed in under one name and left under another. Most people, the kind of people who worked here. Sharp-edged men and women who moved through the building like they were always 10 seconds from needing to run. Most of them didn't notice those things. They were too busy performing confidence to pay attention. Naomi noticed everything. She just never said anything about it unless someone asked. That was the arrangement, unspoken but ironclad. She showed up at 7:45 every morning, brewed the coffee, black, no sugar, single espresso shot for Min-jae, the same way he'd taken it every day without ever once telling her that's how he wanted it, because he'd never had to tell her anything twice. And then she organized whatever needed organizing, coordinated whatever needed coordinating, and stayed invisible until someone needed her to be visible. It was not a glamorous existence. Her desk sat at the far end of the open floor plan, separated from the executive suite by a frosted glass partition and a stretch of gray industrial carpet that she'd personally requested be steam cleaned twice a year because the men who worked here tracked in an impressive amount of outdoor debris. The desk itself was large enough to hold 3 monitors, 4 active filing systems, a ceramic mug that read "World's Okayest Employee" that her cousin had given her as a joke, and enough scattered paperwork that any reasonable observer would assume she was barely managing. She was managing everything. She understood exactly why Min-jae kept her, not because he liked her particularly, not because he was sentimental. Min-jae was the least sentimental person she'd ever encountered in a professional setting, and she'd once briefly worked for a corporate law firm where the senior partners celebrated Christmas by arguing about billing rates. He kept her because she was good, genuinely, structurally good at the kind of administrative intelligence that kept an operation like this from accidentally eating itself. She filed this understanding under things she knew but never said out loud. Alongside, this company does not only move freight, and the men who visit at odd hours are not clients, and the locked room on the East Wing is not a server closet. She was not naive. She had simply made a deliberate decision about which information she needed to act on and which information she needed to file away and never touch again. It was a sustainable system, right up until the man in the charcoal suit walked in and set a package on her desk. She'd been in the middle of cross-referencing a discrepancy in the previous week's Incheon to O'Hare shipment log, two containers listed under a subsidiary code she didn't recognize, when she heard the elevator doors open at 10 past 11, which was unusual because the general staff didn't usually arrive before noon on Thursdays. She looked up expecting one of Min Jae's lieutenants. Park, maybe, who had a habit of arriving unannounced with folders he wanted her to digitize, or Cho, who liked to pretend he needed coffee when what he actually needed was someone to tell him whether his expense report was going to get questioned. It wasn't either of them. The man who walked in was Korean, mid-30s, with the particular brand of expensive posture that suggested he'd grown up being told his posture should be expensive. His suit was charcoal gray, cut close through the shoulders, no tie, collar button open. He wore a watch that Naomi identified as a Patek Philippe, because Min Jae owned the same model, and she'd been asked to get it serviced twice. He carried nothing except the package, which he held loosely in one hand like it was an afterthought. He scanned the room when he entered. Not anxiously, systematically, the way someone does when they've been in enough rooms to know you always identify the exits first. His eyes landed on her and held. She set down her pen. He walked across the floor without hurrying, threading between the empty workstations, and stopped directly in front of her desk. He had a small scar at the left corner of his mouth, barely visible unless you were looking closely, which Naomi was because she looked closely at everything. He set the package down on her filing stack. It was wrapped in burgundy silk ribbon, tied in a clean bow. Beneath the ribbon, she could see dark green cloth, the kind used by specialty bookshops for gift wrapping, the expensive kind that used actual fabric instead of printed paper. "Make sure you open it when you're alone," he said. His English was clean, slightly formal, the accent minimal. "I'm sorry," Naomi said, not moving. "Can I ask who you are?" He smiled. It didn't reach anything above his jaw. "Someone who pays attention." Then he turned, walked back to the elevator, pressed the button, and was gone before she could ask a follow-up question. She sat very still for a moment. Then she wrote down the time, 11:14 a.m., in her spiral notebook. She described his suit, his watch, the scar, the way he'd held the package. She noted that he had not signed in at the front desk, which meant either security downstairs had failed or he'd been allowed up without logging, which were two very different categories of problem. She did not open the package. She pushed it to the corner of her desk and went back to the shipping manifest discrepancy. But she kept the package in her peripheral vision the way you keep a strange dog in your peripheral vision, aware, cautious, not yet alarmed. She was still staring at the manifest when Min Jae arrived. He came in at 12:40, which was typical. He rarely arrived before noon. He wore his usual, black trousers, dark shirt, the kind of quietly expensive clothing that communicated authority without requiring anyone to look directly at a logo. He was 41 years old, lean in the way that suggested he hadn't relaxed in at least a decade, with a face that most people described as unreadable, and that Naomi privately thought of as extremely readable once you accepted that his full emotional range was expressed through the specific angle of his jaw. He stopped at her desk first, as he always did. She handed him his espresso without looking up. "The Incheon manifest from Tuesday," she said. "There are 11 containers logged under the main account code and 2 under a code that doesn't match anything in the system. I flagged it for your review, but I want to know whether I should contact the customs broker or whether this is one of those things I don't contact the customs broker about." He took the coffee. "Don't contact the broker." "Understood." She made a note. "Also, your 2 o'clock call to reschedule. There's a catering invoice from last week's event that accounting is querying, and the security company wants to set up the quarterly maintenance review. Push the security review to next month." "Already done." He was turning toward the executive suite when he stopped. Naomi felt the change before she saw it. It was something in the air, a sudden held quality, like a room going silent not because there was nothing to hear, but because everything audible had simultaneously decided to wait. She looked up. Min Jae was looking at the package on her desk. He was not moving. His coffee cup had stopped halfway to a surface it never reached. His expression had not changed in any identifiable way. And yet every molecule of composure he usually carried with such complete practiced ease had gone somewhere else entirely. What was left on his face was something Naomi had genuinely never seen from him before in 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. It looked to her considerable surprise like fear. Where did that come from? His voice was level, too level, the kind of level that requires active maintenance. A man brought it in around 11. He didn't sign in. Korean, mid-30s, gray suit, Patek Philippe watch, small scar at the left corner of his mouth. He put it down and left without, "Don't touch it again." She blinked. "I haven't touched it since Naomi." He set the coffee cup down, finally, on the wrong surface, the edge of someone else's workstation, which he would never do under normal circumstances. His eyes were still on the package. "Has anyone else touched it?" "Not that I saw." He said something in Korean then, low and sharp, that she was fairly certain was not appropriate for professional settings. Then he raised his voice and called a name, Park, and within 40 seconds, Park materialized from somewhere in the back corridor looking alert, in the way people here got alert, which was different from the way normal office workers got alert. "Get Cho and Lee. Conference room. Now." Min Jae looked at her for the first time since spotting the package. "You too." She carried her notebook. The conference room was the large one at the east end, the one with the long table and the windows that looked out over the river, and by the time Naomi took her usual seat at the far corner, she'd learned early that placing herself at corners gave her sightlines in multiple directions, a habit she'd developed without fully examining why. There were 5 other people in the room, all of them male, none of them looking at her, all of them watching Min Jae. He stood at the head of the table and placed the package in the center of it. He had not opened it. "Does anyone know what this is?" he asked. Silence. "Does anyone know who brought it in?" More silence, plus several expressions that indicated genuine ignorance, and at least one that indicated something more complicated. Naomi described the man who delivered it. Korean, mid-30s, gray suit, specific watch, a scar here. Min Jae touched the left corner of his own mouth briefly, barely, like the gesture cost something. "Anyone?" One of the men she didn't know well, late 40s, worked in the East Wing, name she could never get to stick, shifted in his seat. The shift was minimal, the kind of minimal that most people wouldn't register. She registered it. She wrote nothing in her notebook, just noted the time. Min Jae pulled the ribbon off the package himself. He did it with a controlled deliberateness that she recognized as the physical expression of significant effort. His hands were completely steady. Inside the burgundy wrapping was a book. A first edition, she could see from across the table. The cloth cover was dark navy, worn soft at the corners in the way books get when they're genuinely old rather than artificially aged. The title, stamped in fading gold on the spine, read, "The House on Mango Street, Sandra Cisneros, 1984. The original Arte Publico press printing, which Naomi knew because she'd once spent 20 minutes in a used bookshop on Clark Street looking at the exact same edition and calculating whether she could justify the price. She'd decided she couldn't. She'd mentioned it to no one. The specific high-pitched sensation that moved through her chest when she recognized the book was something she'd later described to herself as the moment her nervous system figured out what her brain hadn't caught up to yet. Min Jae opened the front cover. He looked at whatever was written inside. His jaw shifted. He turned the book around and held it across the table so she could see. In the handwriting, neat, deliberate, slightly too controlled, the handwriting of someone who'd practiced making it look casual, were 6 words. She notices more than she should. The room held a particular kind of silence after that. Not the silence of people who had nothing to say, but the silence of people who were extremely carefully deciding what not to say first. Naomi looked at the inscription. She looked at Min Jae. She looked back at the inscription. "That's my book," she said, which wasn't quite what she meant to say, but was the most honest available summary of the situation. "Yes," Min Jae said, "it is. Someone knew I wanted that specific edition. Yes. Someone watched me in a bookshop." His jaw did the thing. "Apparently." "When?" She heard her voice come out steadier than she felt, which was a small professional victory. "How long has someone been watching me?" He closed the book, set it down, looked at her directly in the way that he reserved for conversations he'd decided to conduct as if they might matter. "I need to speak with Naomi privately," he said to the room. Nobody argued. They were gone inside 90 seconds, which was actually impressive. She sat across from him at the big empty table, the book between them, the river visible through the windows behind his head, gray and slow and indifferent. "Tell me everything," she said. "I will tell you what I know. Some of it you won't like." "I already don't like any of this. Keep going." He put both hands flat on the table, which she'd noticed he did when he was choosing words more carefully than usual. "The man who brought that book is Seo Jae-hyun. He is the second son of Seo Byung-won, who runs a criminal organization in Seoul that has been attempting to establish operations in Chicago for the past 18 months. A pause. My organization has been an obstacle to that. Okay? Jae-hyun has identified you as a point of access. She processed this. He's been following me. For approximately 7 months, we believe. The number sat in the air between them. 7 months. She ran backward through 7 months of her life. The cafe on Wabash where she went Tuesday mornings, the library branch on her block where she returned books on Saturdays, the volunteer shift at the food pantry on the first Sunday of every month, the gym she'd joined in January and visited with humiliating inconsistency. 7 months of ordinary life that had apparently been a surveillance operation. "You said, 'we believe,'" she said. "Yes." "Which implies you've been monitoring the situation." "Yes." She looked at him. "How long have you had people watching me?" The small pause before he answered told her more than the answer itself. "Naomi, how long?" 14 months. She was quiet for a moment. The thing about receiving genuinely unexpected information she'd found was that the first instinct was always to treat it as a problem to solve rather than a thing to feel. She was grateful for that instinct right now. She would deal with the feeling later, in private, probably over something warm and far from this building. "So," she said, "while someone has been stalking me for 7 months without my knowledge, you've had men watching me for 14 months without my knowledge, and the difference you'd like me to appreciate is that yours was protective." "Yes. That's the worst argument I've ever heard." "I know." She looked at the book, at the inscription. She notices more than she should. "What does he want?" she asked. "Jae-hyun. What's the actual objective?" "He wants a meeting, a dinner." Min-jae's expression shifted towards something that might have been discomfort if discomfort were allowed in this room. "With you present." "Why?" "Because he has determined that you are the most approachable point of entry into my operations. That you are—" He paused. "That I'm what?" "That you are unlikely to be perceived as a threat." She thought about this for a moment. "He thinks I'm harmless. He thinks you are easily manipulated." "Ah." She pulled the book across the table toward herself, looked at the cover. "Well," she said very quietly, "he's not entirely wrong about the second part. People like him never see it coming from people like me." Min-jae looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. Something she didn't have a name for yet. Something she filed away in the notebook section of her mind labeled "Return to this later." "You're not going to that dinner," he said. Naomi opened the front cover of the book, read the inscription again. "We'll see," she said. Outside, the river moved past, gray and quiet, and carrying everything downstream. Min-jae said, "We'll see," back to her, silently, from across the table. Not with his mouth, but with the way his eyes went flat, and certain in the manner of a man who had already decided the answer was no, and was simply waiting for the conversation to catch up to that fact. Naomi pretended not to notice. She was good at pretending not to notice things. It was practically a professional skill at this point. She closed the book, stood up, smoothed the front of her cardigan, a dark burgundy one, slightly pilled at the left elbow where she rested it on her desk while typing, and picked up her notebook. "I'll reschedule your 2 o'clock, she said. "Naomi. And I'll have Park's expense report flagged by 3. "I said you're not going." She paused at the door, didn't turn around. "You also said you had men watching me for 14 months, and somehow that decision didn't require my input either." a beat. We'll talk tomorrow. She pulled the door open and walked back to her desk and sat down and stared at her monitors for approximately 90 seconds before her hands started shaking. She put them flat on her thighs under the desk where nobody could see. The office had a particular atmosphere for the rest of that afternoon. The kind of atmosphere that forms when a group of people who are professionally trained to project calm are all internally running calculations at elevated speed. Naomi recognized it because she'd felt it before. After certain phone calls, after certain visitors, after the one incident 8 months ago that nobody discussed out loud, and that she'd quietly logged in her notebook under a date she never revisited. Park walked past her desk 4 times in 2 hours, on his way to places that didn't require him to walk past her desk. Cho refilled his coffee mug 3 times and didn't drink any of it. The man from the East Wing, she was going to learn his name, she decided. She was done letting that slide. Sat at his workstation with the particular stillness of someone whose body had decided that movement might draw attention. Min Jae stayed in his office with the door closed. At 4:15, the door opened and he came out and stood in the middle of the floor and said, to no one specifically, and therefore to everyone, I need the full personnel access log for the building from the past 8 months. Every entry, every exit, every visitor code used. He looked at Naomi when he said it. She was already pulling up the system. I'll have it in 20 minutes, she said. 15. She had it in 12. She printed it, walked it into his office, set it on his desk, and was back at her workstation before he'd finished reading the first page. He came out 11 minutes later with the log in his hand and 3 pages circled in red pen and the expression of a man who had confirmed something he hadn't wanted to confirm. Where's Lee? He said. Lee was the man from the East Wing. Naomi filed that away. He left at 4, Cho said. Said he had a dentist appointment. Min Jae looked at Cho for a long moment. He doesn't have a dentist appointment. The room did the silence thing again. Yeah. She went home at 6:30, which was later than usual. The building's parking garage was 2 floors underground, and she'd learned to take the elevator rather than the stairs after 7 p.m., not for any reason she'd ever articulated to herself, simply a preference that had developed organically over 3 years of being an attentive person in a building that rewarded attentiveness. The elevator opened on level 2, and she stepped out and walked toward her car. A 2019 Honda CR-V in a color the dealership had called Lunar Silver Metallic, and that was functionally just gray. And she was 3 rows away when she became aware of a man leaning against the support column to her left. She stopped walking. He straightened up. One of Min Jae's. She recognized him vaguely, younger, usually stationed near the stairwell on 14. He had his hands visible, which she understood was intentional. Mr. Kang asked me to walk you to your car, he said. Mr. Kang, she said, asked you to watch my car. The young man had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. Ma'am, how long have you been down here? Since noon. She looked at him for a moment. He was probably 26. He had a small tattoo on the inside of his left wrist that disappeared into his cuff. He was trying very hard to look professional and mostly succeeding. Thank you, she said, because he was 26 and following orders, and none of this was his fault. I'm fine from here. Mr. Kang said, Tell Mr. Kong I got home safely. She unlocked her car. Tell him I said he could have just asked. She drove home. She sat in her apartment for 40 minutes without turning on any lights. Then she got up, turned on the kitchen light, made herself a cup of tea she didn't finish, and went to bed. She didn't sleep for a long time. In the morning, she arrived at 7:45. Min Jae was already there, which had happened exactly 4 times in 3 years. He was at his desk with coffee that wasn't hers. He'd made it himself, badly. She could smell the burnt undertone from the doorway. And he had the personnel access log spread across his desk, alongside what looked like a separate set of documents she didn't recognize. She brewed a fresh pot anyway, made his espresso, knocked. Come in. She set the cup down. He looked at it, then at her, with an expression that was the closest thing to sheepish she'd ever seen from him, which on his face looked more like a man who had acknowledged an error in a spreadsheet. About yesterday, he said. You don't have to. I do. He put both hands on the desk. The gesture from yesterday, the careful word one. I made a decision 14 months ago that I should have discussed with you. I won't justify it. She sat down in the chair across from him without being invited, which she never did. You were trying to protect me. Yes. And you didn't think I had the right to know I needed protecting. I thought knowing would put you in more danger. And now? He was quiet for a second. Now the situation has changed. She looked at the documents on his desk. What are those? He hesitated. That particular hesitation, the one where he'd already decided to tell her something but was recalculating the sequence, was one she knew well. Jae-hyun's surveillance reports, on you. The temperature in the room didn't change, but something in her chest did. You have them, she said. We intercepted communications from his team 2 weeks ago. We've known the scope of his surveillance since then. 2 weeks. She kept her voice very even. You've known for 2 weeks. Yes. And you didn't tell me. No. She looked at her hands in her lap. They were steady. She was proud of that in a distant, clinical way. How detailed are they? He didn't answer immediately. Min Jae. She almost never used his name without the formal address. Something in his expression shifted when she did. A small tightening, quickly controlled. How detailed. He turned one of the pages around and slid it across the desk. She picked it up. It was a typed log. Dates, times, locations, her Tuesday cafe, the library, the food pantry, 5 entries on the first Sunday of the month going back to April, the gym, including 3 specific notations about the fact that she often left after only 20 minutes because she was, in Jae-hyun's team's clinical observation, easily discouraged by the equipment wait times. That specific detail, the gym detail, hit differently than the rest. It was so small, so precisely, specifically humiliating. Not because it was secret. Plenty of people knew she had an inconsistent relationship with the gym. It wasn't a scandal. But because it meant someone had watched her leave in defeat 3 times and written it down. Filed it. Used it to build a profile of a woman who could be gotten to through her ordinary, unglamorous, very human routines. She set the paper down. He thinks I'm approachable because I seem discouraged, she said. He thinks you're the path of least resistance into this organization because everyone around you has underestimated your role in it. Min Jae's voice had taken on a particular flatness. He's wrong about what you are. He's not wrong about what everyone assumes. She looked up. Including you? At the beginning? A pause. Honest ones always took longer. At the beginning, he said, yes. I hired you because the agency sent your file and your administrative credentials were strong and you were unlikely to have existing loyalties to anyone in this industry. He held her eyes. I kept you because I was wrong about what I thought I was hiring. She absorbed this, filed it. What did you think you were hiring? A competent administrator who would stay in her lane. And what did you get? Something crossed his face. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the structural suggestion of one, the ghost of the impulse. Someone who reorganized my entire logistics filing system in the first 2 weeks and found 3 billing discrepancies that my accountant had missed for 6 months. That accountant was skimming. I know, that's my point. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, I want to see all of it. Everything you intercepted, every surveillance report, every communication from Jae-hyun's team, everything you have. Naomi, all of it. She picked up her notebook from her lap. Because right now you're making decisions about what I can handle and what I should know, and that is exactly what he's been doing, and I don't think you're noticing the parallel. The silence that followed was a different quality from yesterday's. Yesterday's had been the silence of a room full of people deciding what not to say. This one was the silence of a specific man confronting a specific accurate thing. I'll have copies made, he said. Thank you. She stood up, paused. The dinner. Jae-hyun's request. No. I want to think about it. There's nothing to think about. She looked at him steadily. You just told me you're done making decisions about my life without my knowledge. That was 40 seconds ago. His jaw did the thing. She went back to her desk. The copies arrived at 10 a.m., delivered by Park, who set them on her desk without comment and retreated quickly, which told her Min-jae had briefed him on the change in protocol regarding what Naomi was now authorized to see. She spent the next 3 hours reading. The surveillance documents were comprehensive in the way that serious, resourced people's surveillance documents were comprehensive. Not flashy, not dramatic, just relentlessly thorough. Jae-hyun's team had been tracking her movements since December, which was actually 8 months, not 7, which meant either Min-jae's intelligence was slightly off, or someone had decided to soften the number before telling her. She noted this discrepancy on a fresh page of her notebook without commenting on it yet. Beyond the movement logs, there were photographs. Nothing invasive, nothing she needed to react to emotionally, just street-level images from what she recognized as the intersection near her cafe, the exterior of her building, the parking lot of the food pantry. Surveillance basics. She was a data point in these images, not a person. She understood this was how the exercise worked, and she declined to find it more disturbing than it was. What she found more disturbing, quietly, privately, in the part of her mind she kept separate from her professional processing, was a section of intercepted text messages between Jae-hyun and someone logged only as K2. K2 had provided Jae-hyun with her cafe schedule. K2 knew which Tuesdays she worked late. K2 knew that she sometimes picked up dry cleaning on her way home and which dry cleaner she used. K2 was inside the building. She read the text thread 3 times. Made herself slow down. Read it a 4th time. K2's messages were minimal, short, factual, the communications of someone who understood operational security. But they were patterned. The timestamps clustered around business hours. The information conveyed was administrative in nature. Schedules, routines, absences, the kind of information available to someone with access to the internal calendar system. The kind of information available to perhaps 8 people in this building. She looked at the timestamp on the most recent K2 message. It was from 9 days ago. The information conveyed, Naomi Carter will be out of the office Thursday afternoon for a medical appointment. She had, in fact, had a medical appointment that Thursday afternoon. A routine one. She'd put it in the shared calendar because Min-jae's scheduling occasionally needed to account for her absences. She closed the folder, sat very still for a moment. Then she opened her bottom drawer, moved the ceramic mug, and took out her personal notebook. The spiral one, the real one, not the professional-looking hardcover she carried visibly. This one was small and battered and had been in that drawer since her 2nd month of work, and it contained 3 years of observations that she'd been telling herself were probably nothing. She found the section she wanted, dated entries going back 11 months, small things, a calendar entry that had been edited after the fact, a visitor log with a gap, a requisition form countersigned by someone who'd apparently been on leave that day. She'd flagged all of them as probably nothing. She looked at them now with different eyes. Then she picked up her phone, her personal one, not the desk line, and sent a text to a number she'd never used for work purposes before. I need 30 minutes. Not in the building, somewhere you can walk to. 3 minutes passed. Min-jae's response came back. When? Now, she typed. It's important. Another pause. Longer. Then, coffee place on Monroe. 15 minutes. She put the notebooks, both of them, in her bag. Told Park she was stepping out. Walked to the elevator. In the lobby, she passed Lee, coming in through the revolving door, back from his dentist appointment that Min-jae didn't believe was a dentist appointment. He nodded at her. She nodded back. She noted the time. 11:52 a.m. She noted that he was carrying a coffee cup from a shop 2 blocks in the opposite direction from the nearest dentist office. She wrote it down in the elevator before she forgot. The coffee place on Monroe was a narrow independent shop with exposed brick and a counter that only fit 3 people standing and a single small table in the back that Min-jae was already at when she arrived, which meant he'd come immediately, which told her something. He had a black coffee in front of him and a second cup across the table that she hadn't ordered. She sat down, pulled out both notebooks, set them on the table. He looked at them, then at her face. He said nothing. He was good at reading the room, and the room right now was telling him to wait. K2, she said. A muscle in his jaw moved. He knew the designation. Of course he did. He'd read the same intercepted files. We've been trying to identify. It's someone with access to the internal shared calendar, someone who was in this building consistently from December through last week. She opened the spiral notebook to the marked section. I've been logging inconsistencies for 11 months. I flagged them as probably nothing. Looking at them now, in the context of the K2 communications pattern, 3 of them correspond within 48 hours of information showing up in Jae-hyun's surveillance logs. Min-jae went very still. Not the controlled stillness of a man being careful, the involuntary stillness of a man whose body had received news and hadn't yet transmitted instructions to start moving again. "Show me," he said. She showed him. He looked at the entries. He looked at the K2 timestamps she'd bookmarked in the intercepted file copies. He went back and forth twice, cross-referencing without asking her to help him cross-reference, because he didn't need her to. He was fast, she knew, fast in the way that people were fast when they'd spent years needing to be. When he finished, he set the files down. 8 people have access to that calendar, he said. Yes. 3 of them have been with me for more than 5 years. I know. This could destroy... He stopped, recalibrated. If I move on this and I'm wrong, you won't be wrong. She said it quietly, without drama. I'm not bringing this to you because I think it's possible. I'm bringing it to you because I know which one it is. The table was very small. In the narrow back corner of the coffee shop with exposed brick and the sound of a milk frother somewhere beyond the partition, Kang Min-jae looked at Naomi Carter the way she'd seen him look at intelligence reports that had changed the shape of situations, with absolute focused attention and no visible emotion whatsoever, which she'd learned was actually how he looked when something mattered most. Tell me, he said. She folded her hands on the table, took one breath. It's Lee, she said. The milk frother stopped somewhere behind the wall. Min-jae didn't move. You're certain. The calendar entries align. The dentist appointment this morning, the coffee cup from the wrong direction, and there's a pattern in the building access log from last night that I noticed when I was pulling the full report for you. He badged back in at 11 p.m. The only system that stays accessible after hours without a senior code is the logistics routing database. She watched the information land, watched him absorb it, and then go somewhere interior for approximately 4 seconds, which was the Min-jae equivalent of a long, deliberate pause, before coming back. He's been here 9 years, he said. His voice was absolutely level. I know. He was at my brother's wedding. She said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. Some information was just the shape it was. Min-jae picked up his coffee, drank, set it down, looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. The dinner, he said. She raised an eyebrow. Jae-hyun's dinner. His voice had shifted to the register he used when he'd made a decision and was now executing it. If Lee has been feeding them information for months, Jae-hyun already believes he has an inside advantage. He'll be operating from overconfidence. Yes, she said carefully, an overconfident man across a dinner table from someone he's underestimated. Is a vulnerable man, she finished. He looked at her. The specific look, the one she'd filed under, returned to this later, was back, and this time she let herself identify it clearly. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't admiration exactly. It was the look of a man who had been operating under a set of assumptions and was in the process of replacing them with better ones, and who found the experience both disorienting and something he didn't yet have language for. I'm not going to tell you not to go, he said. Good. I'm going to tell you it's dangerous. I know what it is, and I'm going to be there, not at the table, but there. She nodded once. I know that too. She picked up the second coffee cup, the one he'd ordered for her, black, no sugar, the way she took it. Drank. It was good. He'd been paying attention. There's one more thing, she said. What? Lee can't know we know, not yet. She set the cup down. If he finds out we've identified him before the dinner, Jae-hyun changes his approach. We lose the overconfidence window. Min-jae was already nodding, slowly, the nod of someone running the scenario forward. We let him keep feeding information. We let him keep feeding information, she confirmed. but we control what information he has access to. The coffee shop murmured around them, indifferent and ordinary. A woman at the counter ordered something with oat milk. Outside on Monroe, a delivery truck idled at the light. Naomi looked at Min-jae across the small table and felt, for the first time in 3 years, 2 months, and some number of days, that she was sitting in this situation as herself rather than as a function of someone else's plan. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was something better than comfortable. "All right," Min-jae said. "All right," she said back. She put both notebooks in her bag, stood up, and walked back toward a building that now contained, among other things, a man who had been watching her for 8 months on behalf of someone who wanted to use her, and who was, as of this moment, being watched right back. They went back to the building separately. Min-jae left the coffee shop first, 3 minutes ahead of her, which was his idea and which she agreed with without discussion, because they both understood that Lee, if Lee was watching, and Lee was probably watching, needed to see nothing that looked like coordination. Naomi sat with the remains of her coffee for those 3 minutes and looked at the brick wall across from the table and thought about 9 years. 9 years was a long time to work beside someone and be feeding information about them to their enemies. She tried to find the shape of that in her mind, the daily mechanics of it, the morning commutes and the shared lunch orders, and the 9 years of birthday cards and holiday bonuses and whatever passed for camaraderie in that office, and couldn't quite make it cohere into something she fully understood. She understood betrayal in the abstract. The lived texture of this particular kind still didn't resolve into sense. She finished her coffee, put on her coat, went back to work. Lee was at his desk when she returned, on a phone call, taking notes on a legal pad with the focused expression of a man engaged in legitimate professional activity. He glanced up when she walked past. She gave him the same nod she always gave him. He nodded back. She sat down at her workstation and opened the logistics routing database and began the very careful work of identifying which information Lee had access to and engineering quietly what he would see next. It took 4 days to build the false trail. Min-jae handled the operational side, rerouting actual shipment data into a parallel system that Lee's credentials couldn't touch, creating a convincing shadow version of the logistics calendar populated with plausible but false scheduling information. Naomi handled the granular layer, the small details that made the false information feel lived in. A corrected invoice here, a vendor note there, the kind of administrative texture that said this was real because real things were always slightly messy at the edges. She did it in pieces during normal work hours, at her regular desk, with the appearance of someone doing her regular job. This was not difficult. It was, in a way she didn't examine too closely, almost exactly what she always did. On the 3rd day, Lee sent what they now understood was his K2 message to Jae-hyun's contact. They knew because Park had a secondary access alert set on Lee's workstation that logged outgoing communications to flagged numbers. The message went out at 2:47 p.m., when the office was at its midday low point of attentiveness. Naomi was at the printer when it happened. She heard the alert ping on Park's secondary monitor. Just once. Quiet, the sound of a system doing its job. And she kept her face completely neutral and collected her printed pages and walked back to her desk. That evening, Min-jae texted her one word: confirmed. She put her phone face down on her kitchen counter and cooked herself dinner and ate it at her table by the window and watched the street below and thought about the dinner that was now 4 days away. Jae-hyun's people had specified the venue when the formal dinner invitation arrived through an intermediary, a private room at a restaurant in River North, the kind of place with no menu visible from the street and a reservation system that didn't appear to be accessible to the general public. The invitation was for 8 p.m. on a Friday, extending to both Min-jae and, specified by name, which was its own kind of statement, Naomi Carter. She read her name on the invitation twice. Min-jae had shown it to her without comment, which was how she knew he'd moved past the phase of trying to talk her out of attending. She spent the 2 days before the dinner the way she'd spent the previous 4. Working, reviewing, building the map in her head of everything she knew and everything she needed to know, and the gap between them. The surveillance documents, the K2 communications, The pattern in the logistics data she'd first noticed as a discrepancy in the Inchin manifest, which now, read in full context, told a story about 8 months of carefully redirected information and the specific operational picture Jae-hyun had built of Min Jae's Chicago network. She kept returning to one particular element, the manifest discrepancies she'd flagged the morning of the book delivery. The 2 containers logged under an unrecognized subsidiary code appeared in the K2 communications 11 days before she'd noticed it, which meant Lee had passed it to Jae-hyun's people before it had fully surfaced in the system. Which meant Lee wasn't just logging and reporting. He was actively flagging items of operational interest before they became visible at the administrative level. This suggested a sophistication she hadn't initially credited. She sat with this for a long time on Thursday evening, alone in her apartment with both notebooks open on the kitchen table, and felt the particular sensation that came when a picture she'd been looking at from one angle suddenly required her to tilt her head. Lee wasn't just a leak. Lee was an analyst. He'd been running a parallel intelligence operation inside Min Jae's organization for 9 years, probably longer, and the information he'd been providing wasn't incidental. It was curated, strategic, designed. She picked up her phone and called Min Jae. He answered on the second ring. Naomi. Lee's been here 9 years, she said. Yes. Jae-hyun's father has been trying to get into Chicago for 18 months. Yes. So who was Lee feeding before Jae-hyun? Because 9 years is too long to be activated for an 18-month operation. A silence. The quality of it told her she'd arrived somewhere he'd already been, or somewhere close to it. We don't know yet. You're working on it. Cho is working on it. Does Cho know about Lee? Cho is the only one who does, besides you and Park. She looked at her notebooks. Min Jae. If Lee has been operational for 9 years, there are things inside your organization that were compromised before Jae-hyun's operation even started. Information that went somewhere before it went to Jae-hyun. I know. That means tomorrow night isn't just about Jae-hyun. I know that too. She let out a slow breath. How much don't I know? Another silence, longer. Enough that I'd like to talk to you before tomorrow, in person. Tonight? If you're available. She looked at her kitchen table, both notebooks, the cold cup of tea she'd made an hour ago and forgotten. I'm available. He came to her apartment, which had never happened before in 3 years. She'd been to the office at odd hours, to the conference room, to the coffee shop on Monroe, but he had never come to her space, and the fact of him standing in her doorway in a gray sweater and no jacket, not the work clothes, just a man, just the person underneath the professional infrastructure, was briefly disorienting. She stepped back and let him in. He looked around her apartment with the systematic attention he brought to every new space and said nothing about what he saw, which she appreciated. It was a good apartment, but it was clearly lived in and clearly hers. Books on every horizontal surface, a reading chair pulled close to the window at an angle that caught the best light, a half-finished embroidery project on the coffee table that she'd been working on for 4 months and would probably be working on for 4 more. She made tea. He sat at her kitchen table and she set a mug in front of him and sat across from him and waited. Lee came to me 9 years ago with a referral from someone I trusted, he said. Former military, logistics background, clean record, everything checked. He wrapped his hands around the mug. 2 years ago, I began to suspect that someone inside the organization had a secondary communication channel. Small things. Decisions that were slightly anticipated. Information that arrived with an enemy faster than it should have. 2 years ago, she said. Yes. And Lee? Lee was on my list. He was not at the top of it. He looked at the table. I had someone else at the top of it. Someone I was more certain of. She absorbed this. Who? He met her eyes. Cho. The word landed flatly, and she sat with it for a moment. Cho, who is currently the only person besides me and Park who knows about Lee. Yes. And now you're not sure. I'm sure about Cho. He's been with me since the beginning, the actual beginning, before any of this formalized. There are things he knows that If he'd passed them, I would not still be operating. He said this without drama, as a plain fact. But the 2 years I spent watching Cho were 2 years I wasn't watching Lee with sufficient attention. And in that time, Lee apparently continued doing exactly what he'd always been doing. She turned her mug in a slow circle. Someone pointed you at Cho. Min Jae's jaw moved. That would be the logical conclusion. And Lee was the one who pointed you there. Not directly, but he was positioned to. She stopped turning the mug. So Lee has been running a misdirection operation inside your misdirection operation. He knew you were looking for a leak. He helped direct suspicion toward Cho for approximately 20 months, based on what we've reconstructed. She looked at him. This is a lot more complicated than one man at a dinner table who underestimates me. Yes. What else don't I know? He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was deciding how much the truth would cost and who would pay it. Then he said, Jae-hyun is not the primary. He's the front. His father sent him as the visible pressure, loud, arrogant, obvious, while the actual operational contact inside my organization continued working. The dinner is designed to occupy my attention on one threat while the real extraction continues. Naomi sat very still. What extraction? She said. The logistics routing architecture, the full system, vendor codes, container ID protocols, the subsidiary coding structure. If someone outside this organization obtained a complete map of how our shipping network is structured, they could replicate it. Or they could hand it to law enforcement with enough documentation to be definitive. That's leverage, she said. That's not expansion. That's a threat. Yes. Jae-hyun's father isn't trying to move into Chicago. He's trying to own you. Min Jae said nothing for a moment. Then, trying. She looked at the table, at the embroidery project on the coffee table behind him, a half-finished botanical pattern, careful and slow, and requiring a kind of sustained attention that the rest of her life didn't always allow. She looked at it for exactly the length of time it took her to recalibrate from the dinner she'd been preparing for to the dinner that was actually going to happen. The fake manifest, she said, the false trail we built for Lee. Yes. If the actual target is the routing architecture, they won't just be looking at the shipping calendar. They'll be trying to access the subsidiary coding system, the full vendor database, which Lee has partial access to. Partial. She looked up. Who has full access? 4 people. Myself, Cho, Park, and... He stopped. She watched the stop happen, watched him arrive at something. And, she said, the system administrator, he said slowly, who updated the access credentials 3 weeks ago during the routine quarterly maintenance. The security company, she said, you pushed the quarterly maintenance review to next month. I did. But the system administrator came in anyway. The silence this time was a different shape entirely. Min Jae pulled out his phone, dialed, waited. When Park answered, he said 4 words, the system admin, now, and ended the call. He looked at Naomi across her kitchen table in her apartment where he had never been before, over 2 mugs of tea that were going cold. If they already have the routing architecture, she said, then the dinner isn't an approach. It's a closing. They're coming to tell you the terms. Yes. She stood up, walked to her window and looked out at the street below, dark and wet from an earlier rain, the pavement reflecting the streetlight in long orange streaks. She put her hand on the glass and felt it cold. Behind her, she heard Min Jae's phone vibrate, heard him answer, heard Park's voice, too fast and too tight, the voice of someone delivering news they've been hoping not to have to deliver. She heard Min Jae say, when? She heard Park's answer. She heard Min Jae say, how much? She heard the answer to that too, even across the room. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass. All of it, Min Jae said very quietly, to Park, to the phone, to the room. They have all of it. She turned around. He was standing now. Phone in hand, the call ended, both hands at his sides. The gray sweater and the apartment light and the cold tea on the table. All of it was still there, all the ordinary elements of an ordinary evening, and none of it fit anymore because the shape of the situation had just changed completely, and everything in the room was still arranged for the old shape. Talk to me, she said. The system administrator's credentials were used to access the full vendor database 6 days ago. At 11 p.m., from inside the building. His voice was flat in the way that meant he was doing the necessary work of keeping it that way. Park pulled the server logs 20 minutes ago. The entire routing architecture, every subsidiary code, every vendor ID, every container protocol was copied to an external drive. 6 days ago, she said, while we were building the false trail. While we were building the false trail. She pressed her thumbnail against her palm hard enough to feel it. The false manifests we built for Lee. They're in the logistics calendar, not in the routing architecture. Correct? Which means Jae-hyun's people have the real system architecture and a false operations calendar. Which means, he said, they know our structure, but they believe our next 3 months of operations are something we invented. She breathed. That's not nothing. It's not enough. No. She looked at the floor. Because they don't need our operations calendar. They have the architecture. They can reverse engineer current operations from the structure itself, given enough time. Or they can use what they have as leverage tomorrow night. She looked up. Are you going to that dinner? I don't have a choice. You always have a choice. Not when the alternative is confirming that I know they have the architecture, which tells them we've identified the breach, which accelerates whatever their timeline is for using it. He ran one hand through his hair. She'd never seen him do that before. It was such a human gesture, so unguarded, and the fact of it told her more about the severity of this moment than anything else in the room. I go to the dinner. I sit across from Jae-hyun and let him make whatever he's going to make. And I have to look like a man who doesn't know his organization has already been opened. While actually being a man who knows exactly how far open it is, she said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm still going. Naomi, not as a distraction, not as the person he underestimates. She met his eyes. As the person who spends the dinner finding out whether there's anything in what he says or how he says it that tells us something we can still use. She paused. He's going to be performing at that dinner. Controlled triumph is still a performance. Performances have tells. Min-jae looked at her. The look from the coffee shop, the one she'd finally correctly identified, was there again. And this time it was unguarded in a way that his hand in his hair had been unguarded. And she understood that this was what happened to Min-jae when a situation became serious enough that maintaining the professional surface cost more than he had available. If he comes to that dinner believing he's already won, she said, he will talk. People who believe they've won always talk. They can't help it. It's the whole point of winning. She picked up her notebook from the table. And I will be listening. He looked at her for a long time. Outside, a car moved through the wet street, and its headlights dragged across the ceiling for a moment and were gone. After tomorrow, he said, whatever happens, the surveillance ends. I should have... He stopped, restarted. I should have given you the choice from the beginning, about all of it. Yes, she said, you should have. I'm sorry. She looked at him. In her apartment, in the ordinary light, with cold tea on the table and an unfinished embroidery on the coffee table and the city moving past outside. This was not an apology she'd expected from him, not the word itself, not in this particular unguarded register. I know, she said. She didn't say it was fine. It wasn't entirely fine. But she said it and meant it, and they both understood what they meant. Get some sleep, she said. Tomorrow's going to be long. He nodded. Picked up his jacket from the chair where he'd set it, moved toward the door, paused with his hand on the frame. Naomi. He didn't turn around. The book, the inscription. She notices more than she should. A pause, short and weighted. He meant it as a warning. She held his gaze at the back of his head, at the line of his shoulders in the doorway. I know. I want you to know, he said, that I have thought for a long time that it's the most accurate thing anyone has said about you. He left. She stood in the middle of her apartment for a while after the door closed. Then she sat back down at the kitchen table, opened the routing architecture document she'd printed 2 days ago, and began working through it with a pen, looking for the one thing that Jae-hyun's people might have copied but couldn't possibly have understood. The one irregularity in the system that she'd been treating as probably nothing for 6 months, and was now, in the new light of everything, beginning to look like something else entirely. She found it at 2 a.m. Not the irregularity she'd been hunting, something adjacent to it, something she almost scrolled past because it looked like a formatting artifact, the kind of minor inconsistency that appears in large database exports when the system converts between encoding formats. A single subsidiary code buried in the vendor ID string on page 47 of the routing architecture printout that didn't follow the alphanumeric pattern of every other code in the system. Every other code was 8 characters. This one was 9. She stared at it for a long time. Then she got up, made fresh tea, sat back down, and stared at it some more. The extra character was a numeral, a 7, positioned third in the string, which in the standard coding architecture corresponded to the regional identifier slot. But there was no region coded as 7 in Min-jae's system. Regions ran 1 through 6. She wrote the full code in her notebook, looked at it, looked at the codes on either side of it in the document, looked at the date associated with the anomalous entry. The date was 14 months ago, the same month Min-jae had assigned men to watch her. She didn't sleep after that. She sat at her kitchen table with her notebooks and the routing document and her cold tea, and she built the picture carefully, piece by piece, the way she always built pictures, without rushing, without forcing the pieces into shapes they didn't naturally hold. By 5:30 in the morning, she had something that wasn't yet complete but was complete enough. She texted Min-jae at 6. "Don't use the fake manifest tonight. I found something. Call me when you're up." He called at 6:12. She talked for 4 minutes without interruption. When she finished, there was a silence on his end that was 3 full seconds long, which from him was the equivalent of a stunned pause from anyone else. "You're certain," he said. "Certain enough for tonight. If you're right, I know." "Naomi, if you're right, this is not just about Jae-hyun. I know that too." Another pause. "Are you still coming tonight?" She looked at her kitchen table. Both notebooks. The routing document covered in her handwriting, the margins full of cross-references and timestamps, and a series of arrows connecting things that had looked unconnected for 14 months. "I'm coming tonight," she said. Assad. She spent the day at the office performing normalcy with the focused precision of someone who understood that the performance was now as operationally critical as anything else. She answered emails. She filed the catering invoice that accounting had been querying. She reorganized the secondary filing cabinet that nobody used but that bothered her every time she walked past it. She brought Min-jae his espresso at 12:40 when he arrived and said nothing to him beyond the standard daily briefing, delivered in her normal tone, because Lee was at his desk 12 feet away and Lee was watching everything, and the most important thing Lee needed to believe today was that this was an ordinary Friday. Lee left at 4, same as always. He said he'd see her Monday. "Have a good weekend," she said. He smiled. It was a perfectly ordinary smile. She thought about 9 years and filed the thought away. At 5 p.m., Min-jae closed his office door, and she heard him on the phone for 40 minutes, the cadence of the conversation low and controlled, the specific rhythm of a man coordinating people in multiple locations. At 5:50, the door opened, and he came to her desk and said quietly with his back to the room, "Park and Cho are positioned, 2 others on the exterior. My contact at the restaurant confirms the private room has 1 entrance and a service corridor." "1 entrance," she said. "That's intentional." "Yes." "He wants you contained." "He wants me feeling contained," Min-jae said. "There's a difference." She looked at him. He was in the work clothes tonight. Dark suit, no tie, the same quiet authority he wore every day. And she understood this was also a choice. Not dressing up for Jae-hyun, not signaling that this dinner was an occasion. "I'll be ready by 7:30. He nodded once. "Wear something with pockets." She raised an eyebrow. "For the notebook," he said, and walked back to his office. She went home, showered, changed into a dress she'd owned for 2 years and worn 4 times, dark green, structured at the shoulders, with pockets that were in fact large enough for the small notebook she was going to bring. She looked at herself in the mirror for a moment, not with vanity, but with the particular assessment she brought to most things, noting what was there, noting what it communicated, deciding whether that communication was useful. What was there was a black woman in her mid-30s in a good dress who looked like exactly what she was, someone who worked in a professional office and was attending a business dinner, not intimidating, not remarkable. The kind of person who got overlooked in rooms full of people performing power. She decided this was extremely useful. She put her notebook in her right pocket, her phone in her left. She took one of the small voice-activated recorders from the drawer where she kept emergency supplies, batteries, a spare phone charger, 2 protein bars she'd been meaning to eat for 3 weeks, and put it in the inside seam pocket of her coat. She looked in the mirror one more time. "Okay," she said, to no one. She went downstairs. Min-jae's car was outside. He was in the back seat and she got in beside him, and the driver pulled into traffic, and for the first 4 blocks, nobody said anything. Then Min-jae said, "The code you found, the 9-character string." "Yes." Park ran it against our full historical database tonight. It appears in 43 entries, all logistics, all going back between 11 and 15 years. He looked out the window. The city moved past, lit and wet from another evening rain. 14 months ago is when the entry frequency accelerated. "After you put surveillance on me," she said. "The acceleration started within 2 weeks of that decision." She absorbed this. So someone inside the organization knew you'd made that decision and flagged it. Someone who had access to operational decisions at that level. Which narrows it to 4 people, he said. The same 4 with full access to the routing architecture. She looked at the back of the driver's headrest. "Cho is still clean." "Cho is still clean." No hesitation. "Park?" "Park has been with me since before Chicago, before any of this." His jaw moved. "I trust Park with my life. I have, on several occasions." "So it's not Park and it's not Cho." "No." "And Lee was running information, but Lee didn't have operational access at that level." "No." "So the 4 people are you, Cho, Park, and the system administrator." "And the system administrator. We tracked the company this morning, the system administration firm. It was incorporated 14 months ago. The registered agent is a shell company with a sole address." He said this carefully, the way you say something you've been sitting with for several hours and haven't finished processing. "We've been letting someone into our systems quarterly for a year and 2 months, and I didn't know." She thought about this, about the dimensions of it. Then she thought about what she'd built at 2 a.m. at her kitchen table and said, "Min-jae, the 9-character code, the extra digit, the 7, in the regional identifier slot." "Yes." "Run the same code in the calendar system, not the routing architecture, the internal scheduling calendar. Cross-reference every entry containing that code string against the building access log." He turned to look at her. "You already did this." "Last night, but I need your confirmation on the building access results because my access to that log is read only and I couldn't pull the full picture." A pause. He took out his phone, texted Park. 30 seconds passed. Park's response came back. Min-jae read it, looked at her. 14 entries in the calendar. 14 corresponding building access events. He put the phone down. All after hours. All by the same badge. "Whose badge?" "The system administrators." "No," she said. "That's whose credentials were used. I need to know whose badge, physical badge, the RF chip. Someone who was already in the building used the system administrator's login credentials on a device already inside the perimeter." Another text to Park. A longer wait. She watched the restaurant district coming up through the window. The car would arrive in 3 minutes, maybe 4. Park's response came. Min-jae went still the way he'd gone still when he saw the book on her desk. The total involuntary stillness of a man whose nervous system had received input it didn't have a category for. "Tell me," she said. "The badge," he said, "belongs to someone who left the organization 3 years ago." He looked up. "Someone I believed left voluntarily. Someone I gave a full severance and a clean reference." "And whose access credentials were never deactivated," she said. "No, they should have been. Standard protocol. But they weren't." "No." The car slowed. The restaurant was ahead, a discreet awning and a single doorman and the kind of exterior that communicated expense without effort. "Who?" she said. He said a name she didn't recognize, a Korean name, 2 syllables, said in the register of someone naming a ghost. "He was my logistics director," Min-jae said. He left when I restructured the department. I thought he stopped. I thought he was unhappy with the restructuring. I thought it was professional. I thought he didn't leave, she said. He moved outside and kept working. The car stopped. The driver said nothing. Outside, the doorman was already moving toward the curb. Min-jae looked at her. His face was doing the thing it had done in her apartment, unguarded, underneath the professional surface, the actual man who was also in there. If Young-ho has been coordinating this from outside for 3 years, then Jae-hyun doesn't know the full picture either, she said. Jae-hyun thinks he's running this operation, but Jung-ho has been running Jae-hyun. The door of the car opened. The night air came in, cool and rain-smelling. We still go in, she said. Yes. And we don't tell him we know about Jung-ho. No. Because if Jae-hyun doesn't know Jung-ho's the real architect, then everything he tells us tonight reflects what Jung-ho has let him know, which tells us exactly how much Jung-ho wants Jae-hyun to deliver and how much he's keeping for himself. Min-jae looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. Then he got out of the car. She followed. The private room was exactly as described. 1 entrance, a table for 8 set for 4, low lighting, the smell of very good food, and the particular silence of a room that had been swept for recording devices, which she noted with interest and which was why the recorder in her coat seam, rather than on her body, was going to matter. Jae-hyun was already there. He stood when they entered, which was a performance of courtesy from a man who didn't feel courteous. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the angle of his chin, the way his eyes went to her first, and then to Min-jae, and then back to her with a small private assessment he probably thought was invisible. It wasn't. Mr. Kang, he said. His English was excellent, the accent barely there. Thank you for coming. Jae-hyun, Min-jae said. No honorific, the social signal of a man who didn't concede seniority. Jae-hyun's eyes flickered. He absorbed it. And Miss Carter. He extended his hand. I'm glad you're here. She shook his hand, firm, brief, professional. His grip was slightly too firm, which was information. Mr. Seo, thank you for the invitation. Please. He gestured toward the table. Sit, eat. We can discuss business after. They sat. 2 men with Jae-hyun, who hadn't been introduced, took positions at the far end of the table, not eating, not pretending to eat, just positioned. Naomi counted exits with her peripheral vision without moving her eyes from the centerpiece. Service corridor door to the left, partially open. Main entrance behind them. 2 servers visible through a pass-through window. The food came. She ate. She watched Jae-hyun eat, watch Min-jae, watch her, compose himself, recompose himself, adjust the performance twice in the first 20 minutes. He was excited. Underneath the careful social surface, Seo Jae-hyun was genuinely, viscerally excited, the way someone is excited when they're about to do the thing they've been building toward. She could see it in the way he drank, slightly faster than the situation warranted, in the way he glanced at his phone once, quickly, and then put it face down with the controlled deliberateness of someone telling themselves not to check it again. He was waiting for a signal. She filed this. Min-jae was performing calm the way he always performed calm, which was completely, with no visible seams. He ate. He asked polite questions about the food, the restaurant, the flight from Seoul. He gave Jae-hyun nothing to read. 28 minutes in, Jae-hyun set down his fork. I think we should be direct, he said. He was looking at Min-jae. I have a great deal of respect for what you've built here. I want you to know that. I appreciate that, Min-jae said, which is why I think a conversation about transition makes more sense than other approaches. Min-jae set down his fork with the particular deliberateness of a man who had decided to let something arrive at him rather than going out to meet it. Transition. The market in Chicago is changing. New players, new pressures. It's difficult for any single organization to maintain the kind of control you've built over, 7, 8 years? Jae-hyun smiled. It was a warm smile. It was a practiced warm smile. My father's organization has the infrastructure to absorb certain operations in a way that would be mutually beneficial. Absorb, Min-jae said. Integrate. Protect. Jae-hyun spread his hands. The right framing is a partnership. What kind of partnership? Jae-hyun reached inside his jacket and produced a single folded document, set it on the table between them. Didn't push it forward, just placed it, the gesture of someone presenting rather than negotiating. A structure, very clean. Your name stays on everything public-facing. Day-to-day operations continue as they are. The routing infrastructure is shared. The routing infrastructure, Min-jae said. 2 words. Completely flat. Is what makes this partnership viable, Jae-hyun said smoothly. It's an extraordinary system, genuinely. My people were impressed doesn't cover it. Your people, Min-jae said, the technical team we sent to assess the architecture. Very thorough work, Ms. Carter. He turned to her then, and it was the first time he'd addressed her directly since the handshake, and the way he did it, with a kind of satisfied warmth, like a teacher acknowledging a student's assignment, made something hot move through her chest that she did not allow anywhere near her face. The organizational logic of the coding system. The subsidiary structure. It's elegant. Were you involved in designing it? She looked at him. She had approximately 4 seconds to decide what version of Naomi Carter sat across from Seo Jae-hyun at this table, and she chose the one that had been in the room all along, the one who noticed everything and said less than she knew. I just keep the files organized, she said. She made her voice soft, slightly uncertain, the version of herself that rooms full of men had always been most comfortable with. I'm not really the technical side of things. Of course, he nodded. The warmth became something adjacent to condescension, barely visible, gone in a second. But there, she registered it, pressed her thumbnail against her palm under the table, held the pressure steady. The proposal, Jae-hyun continued, turning back to Min-jae, is straightforward. 60-40 revenue share in our favor for the first 2 years, reflecting the infrastructure investment we're making. After 2 years, renegotiation based on… No, Min-jae said. The table went quiet. Not dramatically, just the particular quality that spaces get when a word lands and changes the temperature. Jae-hyun looked at him. Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise, exactly. More like a recalculation. I think if you review the proposal, I've heard the proposal. There are aspects you haven't. 60-40 with your family in the 60 position is not a partnership. It's a transfer. You know that. Min-jae looked at him steadily. Your father knows that. My father. Your father sent you to Chicago to present terms he believes I have no choice but to accept. Min-jae picked up his water glass. Drank. Set it down. What makes him believe that? Jae-hyun went very still. It was the first moment all evening where his performance slipped below the surface and something real showed through. Not the excitement anymore, but something tighter. The recalculation becoming visible. I'm not sure I follow, he said. What leverage, Min-jae said, does your father believe he has that would make these terms acceptable to me? The question sat in the middle of the table between all the good food and the expensive setting and the 2 men who were not eating anymore and Naomi Carter who had not moved. Jae-hyun looked at Min-jae for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket a second time and produced a USB drive. He set it on the table next to the proposal document. The full routing architecture, he said. Every code, every vendor ID, every subsidiary structure, enough to reconstruct your entire operation, or enough to hand to the federal authorities with a cover letter explaining what it is. A pause. My father prefers the partnership. The alternative is less elegant. Min-jae looked at the USB drive, at Jae-hyun, at the USB drive again. His face showed nothing. Naomi looked at the USB drive and felt her 2 a.m. kitchen table calculations complete themselves in real time and knew, with the clean certainty of something clicking into the right position, that the drive on the table was not the full picture. Can I ask something? She said. Both men looked at her. Jae-hyun with the indulgent attention of someone humoring a secondary presence. Min-jae with the specific attention of someone who had agreed to follow her lead. Of course, Ms. Carter, Jae-hyun said. The routing architecture on that drive. She nodded toward it. Was it provided by your technical team or by someone with long-term internal access? A pause. Very short. But there. I'm not sure that's because the system has a redundancy layer, she said gently, conversationally, in the voice of someone who keeps the files organized. A secondary coding structure built into the subsidiary IDs. Anyone who extracted the architecture without understanding the redundancy layer would have a document that looks complete. She paused. But isn't. Jae-hyun's eyes moved to Min-jae. Min-jae's expression had not changed. Ms. Carter, Jae-hyun said, his voice still controlled but with something underneath it now, something compressed. I don't think you fully understand what the 9-character code, she said, in the vendor ID string. 3rd character position. She watched his face. Your technical team flagged it as a formatting artifact. She paused one beat. Didn't they? The compression underneath his voice became something else. She watched him try to hold the surface of the performance and watched the surface develop a crack that started at his eyes and moved downward. How? He said, and then stopped. And then, who told you? Nobody told me, she said. I found it at 2 a.m. looking at a printout at my kitchen table. She held his gaze. The 9-character code isn't a formatting artifact. It's a flag. It marks every entry in the database that links to a secondary routing system, a parallel architecture that doesn't appear in the document your team extracted. She let this sit for exactly 2 seconds. Which means the leverage your father sent you here with tonight is incomplete. The room was completely silent. Outside the private room, the restaurant moved and breathed, indifferent and normal. Someone laughed on the other side of a wall. A glass clinked. In here, Seo Jae-hyun was sitting at a table across from the woman he'd had surveilled for 8 months. The woman his entire operation had coded as the path of least resistance. The clumsy and approachable and easily manipulated secretary who kept the files organized and didn't understand the technical side of things. And he was coming to the end of a very fast recalculation. She watched it happen on his face. The arrival of understanding. The specific cold quality of a man realizing he has been in the wrong meeting this entire time. His right hand moved toward the USB drive on the table. Don't, Min-jae said, very quietly. The single word landed with the weight of everything it represented, which was 9 years and a name he'd said in her apartment, like naming a ghost in a parallel operation that had been running inside his organization since before she'd arrived. Jae-hyun's hand stopped. There's something else you should know, Min-jae said in the same quiet register. About who gave you the architecture. About who has been managing this operation from outside my organization for the past 3 years. He looked at Jae-hyun steadily. About Jung-ho. The name hit Jae-hyun like a physical thing. His face changed in a way that was not a performance. The careful, composed, well-prepared face of a man who'd come to a dinner he believed he'd already won cracked open just enough to show what was underneath. Not the arrogance, not the calculated confidence, but something much more basic. He hadn't known. Jung-ho had sent Jae-hyun into this room without telling him the full picture of his own operation, and now Jae-hyun was sitting across from the 2 people in Chicago who apparently knew more about what he'd been running than he did. He works for us now, Naomi said. It wasn't true. Not yet. But the look on Jae-hyun's face in the moment she said it told her everything she needed to know about whether it could become true, about the exact depth of the fracture between Jae-hyun and the man who'd sent him here, about how much structural damage she could do with exactly that sentence in exactly this room. Jae-hyun's 2 men at the far end of the table had shifted forward slightly, not standing, not yet, but the shift of bodies that preceded standing. Min-jae's phone buzzed once on the table beside his plate. He didn't look at it. He already knew what it meant. Park and Cho were in position. The service corridor door to the left was still partially open. Jae-hyun looked at the USB drive on the table, at Min-jae, at Naomi, at the USB drive again. The calculations running across his face were visible now, no longer hidden under the performance, because the performance had served its purpose, and its purpose was over. What do you want? He said. His voice was flat. not hostile, emptied. The voice of a man who has played his cards and watched them be insufficient and is now doing the math on what he has left. Min-jae picked up his fork, cut a piece of the fish that had been sitting untouched in front of him for the past 20 minutes, ate it, set the fork down with the precision of a man who had all the time available and intended to use it on his own schedule. "I want your father on the phone," he said. "Tonight, from this table." He looked at Jae-hyun without expression. "And I want Jung-ho's location." Jae-hyun looked at him for a long moment. The restaurant moved and breathed around the room. Someone's laugh carried through the wall again, bright and oblivious and very far away. "And if I give you both," Jae-hyun said. "Then we have a conversation about what happens next," Min-jae said. "That is considerably different from the one your father prepared you for." Jae-hyun's jaw tightened, the tightening of a man swallowing something that went down badly. Naomi picked up her wine glass. She hadn't drunk from it all evening, and held it without drinking and watched Seo Jae-hyun come to the decision that the room had been designed, from the moment she'd sat down, to bring him to. He reached into his jacket, not for the USB drive this time, for his phone. He found his father's number and turned the screen to show Min-jae, and then held the phone above the table with a steadiness that cost him something visible. "Before I make this call," Jae-hyun said, very quietly, looking not at Min-jae, but at her, "I want to know one thing." She looked back at him. "The redundancy layer," he said. "The secondary routing system. Is it real?" She held his gaze across the table, across the ruins of a dinner that had been designed to end very differently, and she said nothing for exactly long enough. Then, "Call your father." He pressed dial. The phone rang once, twice. On the third ring, the door to the private room opened. Not the main entrance, the service corridor, and the man who stepped through it was not a server. He was in his 50s, gray at the temples, wearing a dark coat over a suit that fit him the way suits fit people who'd been wearing expensive suits for 30 years. And Naomi had never seen his face before, but she knew from Min-jae's stillness, from the absolute halt of everything in him, exactly who this was. Jung-ho had not, apparently, waited to be found. Jung-ho had come to finish this himself. The phone was still ringing. Jae-hyun had not ended the call. He held it above the table with his arm suspended at an angle that had stopped making sense, his eyes fixed on the man who had just walked through the service corridor door, and the phone rang a fourth time and a fifth time into a room that had gone so completely still that Naomi could hear the faint tinny sound of the ringtone leaking from the speaker. Jung-ho looked at the phone in Jae-hyun's hand, at Min-jae, at Naomi, then back at Min-jae, with the particular quality of attention that belonged to someone who had been thinking about this specific room and these specific people for a very long time. "End the call," he said to Jae-hyun. His Korean was quiet and even. Jae-hyun ended it. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Naomi had ever sat inside. Jung-ho pulled out the chair at the head of the table. Neither Min-jae's end nor Jae-hyun's, the chair that had been empty all evening, and sat down with the unhurried ease of a man arriving somewhere he'd always intended to arrive. He was 53, she would later learn. He looked like someone who had spent 53 years making himself difficult to read, and had largely succeeded. He had a small travel case beside him, carried in his left hand, set now on the floor beside his chair. Dark nylon, the size of a laptop bag. He did not open it. "I apologize for the theatrical entrance," he said in English, looking at no one specifically. "The service corridor was faster." Nobody responded to this. "Jae-hyun," he said, "you can go." Jae-hyun looked at him. Something crossed his face, not quite anger, not quite humiliation, the complicated expression of a man who has just understood the full dimensions of how thoroughly he was used. "I'm not... go." Jung-ho said it the same way the second time. Quiet, flat, final. Jae-hyun looked at Min-jae. Min-jae gave him nothing. Jae-hyun looked at Naomi, briefly, and she held his gaze without expression, and then he stood up, and his two men stood with him, and they left through the main entrance without another word. The door swung closed. 3 people remained at the table. Jung-ho looked at Min-jae. How long have you known? That it was you? Min-jae's voice was even, completely, expensively even. Last night. And before that. That there was someone, 2 years. Jung-ho nodded slowly, the nod of someone receiving a grade they'd expected. I thought you'd identified it sooner. You're thorough. I was looking in the wrong direction. Yes. Jung-ho glanced at Naomi. I helped with that. She looked back at him. The suspicion about Cho, she said. That was you. Administrative misdirection. Lee provided the mechanism. I provided the framing. He said it without pride, without particular effect, the way someone describes a technical process. It bought approximately 18 months. And Lee, she said. How long? Lee came to me, not the other way around. For the first time, something moved in Jung-ho's expression, not guilt, not regret, something more functional. The acknowledgement of a relevant fact. 7 years ago, he had his own grievances. I had infrastructure. It was a practical arrangement. A practical arrangement, Min-jae said. The flatness of his voice had acquired an edge. Not loud, not dramatic, just the edge. He was at my brother's wedding. I know. Jung-ho held Min-jae's eyes. I know that. He let this sit and didn't dress it up. And Naomi marked this as the first thing about him that felt like an actual person, rather than a function. Min-jae, I left 3 years ago because the restructuring made my position. I know why you left. Do you? You wanted operational authority. I wasn't ready to give it. You believed that was an error in my judgment, and you decided to correct it from the outside. Min-jae looked at the man across from him with no visible emotion and considerable visible clarity. That's what 3 years of reconstruction looks like. Jung-ho was quiet for a moment. You were always better at the picture than the details. And you were always better at the details than the picture. Min-jae looked at the travel case on the floor beside Jung-ho's chair. What's in the bag? Jung-ho reached down, set the case on the table, opened it. Inside, a hard drive, a folder of printed documents, and a second USB drive, different from the one Jae-hyun had placed on the table, older, with a small strip of electrical tape across the top, and 2 characters written on the tape in Korean that Naomi couldn't read. Everything, Jung-ho said. Every file I took, every copy I made, every communication with Lee, with the CO family, with the external contacts I developed. He put both hands flat on the table beside the case, palms down. And the system administrator firm, the shell company, the full ownership chain going back to the original incorporation. He paused. Including the component that Jae-hyun's father doesn't know about. Min-jae looked at the case, at Jung-ho. Why? Because it's over, Jung-ho said. Because I've been doing this for 3 years and I'm 63 years. He stopped, corrected. I'm 53 years old and I've spent 3 years building a weapon I no longer want to fire. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. Naomi looked at the 2 men across the table from each other. She looked at the hard drive and the folder and the USB drive with the electrical tape. She looked at Jung-ho's hands, flat on the table, the hands of a man who had arrived at this room under his own power, having made whatever decision brought him here before he'd walked through the service corridor door. The secondary routing system, she said. The parallel architecture. Does it exist? Jung-ho looked at her. For the first time since he'd sat down, he looked at her with something that wasn't assessment, something with more texture. You found the 9-character code. Last night, 2 a.m. I built that flag into the system 4 years ago, before I left. He held her gaze. It was designed to be found by someone who was looking closely enough. I didn't know who that would be. A pause. It's been in the database for 4 years, waiting for the right person to look at it in the right way. She absorbed this. It's a dead end, she said. There's no secondary system. No. The flag leads nowhere. The flag leads to a recursive loop in the subsidiary code that confirms the architecture was extracted by someone who didn't understand its internal logic. He said this to her specifically, with the focused attention of a man speaking to the only person in the room who would follow it. It's a verification tool. Anyone who extracted the database without understanding the flag would assume they had the complete picture. They wouldn't. Because the flag makes the extracted document self-referential without being self-consistent. Yes. She looked at the USB drive Jae-hyun had left on the table, the one he'd arrived with, the leverage. So the document Jae-hyun brought tonight is internally inconsistent in a way that would be immediately apparent to any federal analyst who examined it seriously. Jung-ho said this without satisfaction. I designed the flag that way, not to protect Min-jae at the time, to protect my own exit strategy. But the effect is the same. The room held this. Outside, the restaurant continued to exist, indifferent and ordinary. A server's voice murmured something beyond the partition. A glass was set down on a hard surface somewhere. Min-jae had not moved. He was looking at Jung-ho with the expression he wore when he was processing something that required him to revise a structural assumption which she'd learned was one of the more significant things he did. You built a flag that made the leverage unusable, Min-jae said. 3 years ago, I wanted leverage. Now I want to go home. Jung-ho's voice was flat. I have a daughter in Busan. She has 2 children. I have been in Chicago for 11 years, and I want to go home, and I cannot go home with this unfinished, because you would find me eventually, and I know what that means. He looked at Min-jae steadily. So I'm finishing it. By giving me everything. By giving you everything and asking for a clean exit. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. Not the silence of threat or recalculation or revelation. The silence of a negotiation that was not a negotiation. That was a man setting something down and stepping back from it and waiting to find out what that cost. Min-jae looked at the travel case, the hard drive, the folder, the USB drive with the electrical tape. Lee, he said. Lee stays. He made his choices. Jung-ho said it without inflection. I'm not negotiating his exit, only mine. The Seo family. Jae-hyun will deliver his father the news of tonight. Byung-won is pragmatic. Without Lee's intelligence feed and without the leverage he believed he had, there is no viable Chicago operation. He'll recalculate. Jung-ho paused. He may send someone in 6 months to test the edges, but the main operation is over. You're certain? I built the main operation. I know what it requires to function. For the first time, a ghost of something moved across Jung-ho's face that might, in better light, have been called weariness. It requires me. Min-jae sat with this for a long moment. He turned the wine glass on the table in a slow half circle without drinking from it, and Naomi watched his jaw and his eyes and the specific set of his shoulders and read in all of it the cost of what he was being asked to do, to let the man who had spent 3 years dismantling his organization, who had planted a mole at his brother's wedding, who had misdirected his suspicion and engineered his exposure, to let that man take a flight home to see his grandchildren. It was not a small thing to ask. She did not say anything. This was not her decision. She'd made her contributions tonight and she knew their limits, and this was one of them. Min-jae stopped turning the glass. The shell company, he said. The system administrator firm. It gets dissolved. Tonight. Agreed. The external contacts you developed, every name, every channel, every communication structure, complete. It's in the folder. Lee is handled by me. On my timeline, you have no further contact with him. Agreed. And you go home, Min-jae said. Busan. And you stay there. He looked at Jung-ho. If I ever have reason to look in your direction again, you won't. Jung-ho said it simply, not as a promise made for effect, as a statement of fact from someone who knew the cost of the alternative. You won't. Min-jae looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then he reached across the table and closed the travel case and pushed it toward Naomi's side of the table without looking at her. Take that, he said. She took it. Min-jae pushed back his chair, stood, looked down at Jung-ho, who remained seated. The car outside will take you to whichever hotel you're at, Min-jae said. Your flight should be booked for tomorrow morning, not afternoon. He straightened his jacket. Don't make me say this twice. Jung-ho looked up at him from the chair. Whatever lived on his face in that moment was private enough that Naomi looked away from it, At the table, at the USB drive Jae-hyun had left. At the centerpiece she hadn't looked at all evening. Min-jae, Jung-ho said. Min-jae waited. The girl who found the flag. He didn't look at Naomi when he said it. Keep her close. Min-jae said nothing. He walked to the main entrance, held the door, and waited for Naomi to go through first. She picked up the travel case, walked past the centerpiece, past the ruins of a dinner for four, through the door and into the corridor and out through the restaurant's front entrance into the night air, which was cold and clean and smelled of rain and the river somewhere to the east. She stood on the sidewalk and breathed. Park was across the street. He materialized the way he always materialized, present suddenly, without having appeared to arrive, and Min-jae said 4 things to him in Korean, quick and low, and Park took the travel case from Naomi and was gone again. The car was at the curb. They got in. She sat back against the seat and looked at the ceiling of the car and felt the cumulative weight of the past 2 weeks. No, the past 14 months, the past 3 years, all of it, settle into her body at once, the way exhaustion sometimes waits politely until the crisis has resolved before arriving in full. Her hands were shaking slightly. She put them in her lap and let them shake because there was nobody performing for anymore. Min-jae sat beside her. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking out the window at the city moving past, and he had the expression he wore when he was somewhere interior that wasn't fully accessible from the outside. They didn't speak for 4 blocks. Then he said, very quietly, "The redundancy layer. Was any of it real?" She turned her head to look at him. He was still looking out the window. "No," she said. "I invented it in the car on the way here." A pause. Long enough that she counted 3 streetlights go past. "You told him Jung-ho works for us," he said. "Yes." "That was also invented." "In the moment, yes." Another pause. "It worked." He didn't know enough about Jung-ho's operation to know it wasn't true, which is what I was counting on. She turned back to look at the ceiling. People who've been managed by someone never know the full picture of what that person is doing. Jae-hyun knew what Jung-ho let him know. Jung-ho let him know exactly enough to make him useful. He came to close the operation himself because he knew Jae-hyun couldn't close it. He came because he wanted it over, she said. People who want something over badly enough will take the first available exit. She paused. He had a daughter. He mentioned her first. Min-jae was quiet. "That's why I believed him," she said. "Not the hard drive, not the folder, the daughter. That's not something you introduce into a room unless it's true." The car turned north. The river was briefly visible between buildings, dark and moving. "Lee," she said. "Tomorrow." "How?" Carefully. His voice was controlled in the way it got when he was managing something that had weight to it, something that wasn't clean. "Lee has been here 9 years. Certain procedures require more care than others." He looked down at his hands. "It won't be tonight." She nodded. She didn't ask for more detail. There were still edges she didn't need to stand at, and this was one of them, and she'd made her peace with that some time ago. "I want to know," she said, "when it's done. I'll tell you." The car moved through the wet streets, north and west, toward her neighborhood. She watched the city pass and thought about the book on her desk 3 weeks ago. The burgundy ribbon. The man who'd set it down with the smile of someone who knew he'd already won. She thought about the inscription. She notices more than she should. And the way Min-jae had read it aloud in the conference room with the particular flatness that meant something. "He wasn't wrong," she said. "Who?" "Whoever wrote that inscription. I do notice more than I should." She looked at her hands in her lap. They'd stopped shaking. "It's gotten me into a significant amount of trouble." "Yes," Min-jae said. There was something in the word that wasn't quite dry and wasn't quite warm and was specifically, precisely his. "It has." The car stopped outside her building. She reached for the door. Stopped. "The surveillance," she said. "It ends." "It ends." No hesitation. "Park pulled everyone off your regular routes last week. I should have done it sooner." "Yes." "I know." She opened the door, got out, stood on the sidewalk and looked back into the car, at Min-jae still seated in the back, looking at her from the dark interior. Go home, she said. Naomi, get some sleep. She held his gaze. Tomorrow is going to be a different kind of long day. She closed the door, watched the car pull away, went inside. Lee came in Monday morning at his usual time, 8:15, with a coffee from the place 2 blocks away. He sat at his workstation and logged in and answered emails with the composure of a man who believed the weekend had reset the room to ordinary. It hadn't. At 10:30, Min-jae came out of his office and asked Lee to join him in the conference room. His voice was the same as it always was. He held the door. Naomi sat at her desk and listened to the conference room door close. She worked. She answered emails, filed the week's accumulated paperwork, rescheduled the security maintenance review that Min-jae had pushed back to next month, and did all of it with the focused steadiness of someone who understood that the work was also how she stayed in her own body when everything around her was doing something she couldn't control. 40 minutes later, 2 men she'd never seen before came through the building's main entrance. They signed in at the front desk. They went to the conference room. They came out 25 minutes after that, and Lee was not with them, and they signed out and left. Min-jae came out of the conference room and walked to her desk and stood in front of it for a moment. His face was the controlled face, the working face, but his eyes were doing something different. Lee will not be returning, he said. She nodded. The 2 men were from a law enforcement contact I maintain, he said. There's sufficient documentation for a federal case. They've been building parallel to our situation for some time. He paused. Lee was useful to them as well, in different directions. She thought about 9 years, about birthday cards, about her name in a surveillance log somewhere in a file that had been handed over to people in different offices. He'll be processed properly. He won't be harmed. Min-jae held her gaze. I know that matters to you. It matters, she said. Yes. He nodded, stood at her desk a moment longer, the way he sometimes stood when he delivered news and was waiting to see what it did to the room before deciding what came next. The Seo family, he said. Byung-won called this morning, requested a withdrawal from Chicago operations, effective immediately. Something crossed his face, not satisfaction exactly. The thing that came after satisfaction had been processed into practical information. He used the word retreat. I thought that was precise of him. Young-ho's flight left this morning, she said. She'd checked. She wasn't sure why she'd needed to know. Yes. Min-jae looked at her. You checked. I needed to know it was actually over. It's over. She looked at her monitors, at the logistics calendar, the shipping manifests, the week's accumulated work. The routing architecture, she said, the flag Jung-ho built in. Park is rebuilding the system, new codes, new structure, clean. He paused. He said the flag was elegant work. It was, she said. I hate that it was. Min-jae was quiet for a moment. Then, the subsidiary firm, the false manifests we built. Jae-hyun's people attempted to use them Friday night, whatever timeline they had for the false operations calendar. 3 shipments were redirected to the ghost warehouses we'd staged. He paused. They lost significant resources. How significant? Significant enough that the Seo family's Chicago operation is not a viable topic for at least 5 years. He looked at her. The false manifests worked, even without being the primary mechanism. She let that land. She'd built those manifests line by line, at her regular desk during regular hours. She'd made them feel lived in. She'd been right that real things needed to be slightly messy at the edges. And she'd been correct about the messiness level, and the result was significant loss for an organization that had been targeting her for 8 months. Good, she said simply. Yes, he said. Good. He went back to his office. She went back to the manifests. 3 days later, he called her into his office at 4 p.m. This was not unusual. He called her in regularly for briefings, for decisions that required her administrative input, for the practical management of an organization that ran in part on her capacity to keep it running. She came in with her notebook, sat in the chair across from him, as she had hundreds of times. He slid a document across the desk. She picked it up, read the first paragraph, set it down. "This is a new employment agreement," she said. "Yes." She looked at the document, at the title, which named a position that had not previously existed in the organization's structure, and the associated compensation, which was considerably different from her current compensation. "Director of Intelligence Operations," she said. "Yes." "That is not a real title in a freight logistics company." "No," he said. "It isn't." She looked at him. He was doing the careful word hand position, both palms flat on the desk. "Minjae. The organization needs to function differently going forward. The events of the past 3 weeks demonstrated certain structural vulnerabilities that require reorganization." He held her gaze. "You are the most significant analytical resource I have. You have been, arguably, since the second month of your employment. I have not been paying you like it or treating you like it, and the past 14 months have made clear what that oversight costs. This is a significant change in my role. Yes. Comes with significant increase in what I know. Yes. And what I'm responsible for. Yes." He paused. "You don't have to take it. The current arrangement can continue. I'm not—" He stopped, restarted. "This is not pressure. It's an offer." She looked at the document. At the organizational chart attached to the second page, which showed a new structural layer between operational staff and executive decisions, occupied by a single position, hers, if she signed. "The surveillance is over," she said. "You already confirmed that. Completely over. Independent of this offer. That's done. I set my own hours for the analytical work. Within reason. My analytical conclusions go directly to you without being filtered by Park or Cho." "Agreed. And I keep my desk where it is." A pause. "You could have an office." "I like my desk where it is," she said. "I see the whole floor from there." The ghost of the non-smile crossed his face, the structural suggestion of one. "Your desk stays where it is." She picked up the document. Read it again, carefully, all the way through, the way she read everything. Once for information, once for what was missing. Nothing was missing. It was clean and specific and reflected, she realized, a conversation about what she needed that he'd had with himself before bringing it to her. She put it back down. "I want 2 weeks to think about it." "Of course. And I want the catering invoice that accounting has been querying fully resolved before the end of the week. That's been sitting for 3 weeks and it's bothering me." "I'll tell Park." She stood, picked up her notebook. "Is that everything?" "Yes," he said. Then, "No." He looked at the desk for a moment. "I told you the surveillance ended. I want you to know specifically. Every log, every report, every photograph. It was destroyed. Not archived. Destroyed." He looked up. "You have my word." She held his gaze. She thought about 14 months of ordinary life documented and filed and watched over. Her Tuesday cafe. Her library. The gym she visited with humiliating inconsistency. All of it gone. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. She went back to her desk. 2 weeks passed. The organization resettled into itself the way buildings resettle after something structural shifts. The same from the outside, changed in the load-bearing places. New staff came in to replace Lee's position. The routing architecture was rebuilt and recoded. Park ran 3 separate security audits in 10 days, growing increasingly meticulous with each one, which Naomi took as a healthy sign that he'd taken the breach personally. Cho began sending her CC'd emails on operational matters she hadn't previously been copied on. He didn't mention the new title. He just began including her. She noted this as the most practical form of acknowledgement available in their particular environment and appreciated it accordingly. The catering invoice was resolved on Thursday of the first week. She noted this also. On a Wednesday morning in late November, she came in at 7:45, brewed the coffee, and found Min-jae already in his office with the door open, which had now become a new pattern. He'd begun leaving it open in the mornings, she'd noticed, in a way he hadn't before. She brought his espresso, set it down. "I'll sign the agreement," she said. He looked up from whatever he was reading. "When?" "Today. I want one clause added." "What clause?" "Mutual notification. If anything affects my safety, my routine, my personal life, anything, I'm told immediately, not when you've assessed whether I can handle it, immediately. Done, he said, without hesitation. The lack of hesitation meant he'd expected this clause, had probably drafted it himself and removed it because he wasn't sure of its reception. She went back to her desk, printed the agreement, wrote the clause in the margin in her own handwriting, and signed it. She walked it back in, set it on his desk. Left. He came out 11 minutes later and stood at her workstation and said nothing for a moment, just stood there, which was unusual enough that she looked up from her monitor. "There's something else," he said. "There usually is." "There's a bookshop." He said it carefully, the same way he said things when he'd been preparing them. "On Clark Street. You mentioned it once, a long time ago. You said there was an edition of something you'd been looking at and couldn't justify." She went very still. "I'd like to go there," he said. "Saturday, if you're available." She looked at him, at the controlled face and the careful voice, and the something underneath both of them that she'd been filing under returned to this later for 3 years, and was now returning to. "That's a very unusual ask," she said. "Yes. From an employer. I'm aware that the framing is changing," he said. "Is it?" "I would like it to." He held her gaze. "If that's something you want, I recognize it may not be." She thought about the book on her desk 3 weeks ago, burgundy ribbon, the inscription, the way the whole shape of her ordinary life had turned out to have been watched and documented and used. She thought about 14 months of protection she hadn't known about 2 cold cups of tea in her apartment on a Thursday night, about a man who'd come through her door without a jacket, just himself, and sat at her kitchen table and told her the truth even when it cost something. She thought about the thing she'd been filing under returned to this later, and the fact that she was now returning to it. "Saturday," she said, 11 a.m. Something happened to his face, small, controlled, genuine. "I'll pick you up." "I'll meet you there," she said. "I know where it is." He almost smiled. She was beginning to collect the almost smiles the way she collected other data, carefully, for reference, for what they told her about the spaces where the real information lived. She turned back to her monitor. He went back to his office. Outside, November moved through Chicago the way November always did, cold and gray and indifferent and very much itself, not promising anything, not apologizing for anything, just the actual weather of the actual season with no embellishment available. The bookshop on Clark Street was narrow and warm and smelled of old paper and the particular dust that collected in places where books had been sitting a long time thinking their own thoughts. Saturday was bright and cold, the sun doing the thing it did in late autumn, where it was present but unwilling to commit to warmth, and she got there first, at 5 to 11, and stood outside for a moment looking at the window display. He arrived at 11 exactly. He was in the gray sweater again, the one from her apartment, and a dark coat, and he looked, she thought, like a person rather than a function, which was the most precise way she could describe the difference between Min-jae at work and Min-jae on a Saturday morning on Clark Street. "You're early," he said. "You're on time," she said. "That's different." They went inside. The shop was small enough that 2 people moving through it was a negotiation of space, and they moved through it at the browsing pace of people who were actually looking rather than performing looking, which meant sometimes they were in the same narrow aisle and sometimes they weren't, and neither of them managed this with any particular grace, and both of them pretended not to notice the several times they reached for the same shelf. She found the Cisneros edition in the same spot she'd found it 3 years ago, on the bottom shelf of the back corner section, leaning slightly against its neighbor, the way books lean when they've been passed over enough times to relax into the space. She crouched down and picked it up, opened it. Inside the front cover, in her own handwriting from 3 years ago, very small, was a note she'd written to herself. "Can't justify yet. Come back." She looked at it for a long time. Behind her, she heard Min-jae stop moving. She stood up, turned around. He was 2 feet away, in the narrow aisle, and he was looking at the book in her hands with the expression she'd seen on his face in the conference room when he'd first opened the other copy, the one with Jung-ho's inscription. Except this time it was different. This time, what was on his face was not fear. She held the book out to him. "Look," she said. He took it, read her note inside the cover. He looked at it for a moment that lasted several seconds. Then he turned it over and looked at the price sticker on the back and walked to the front of the store without a word, and paid for it. She stood in the narrow aisle and let out a slow breath. He came back, handed her the book. She took it. My handwriting is in the cover, she said. I know. You just bought me a book with my own handwriting in it. I know, he said. I thought that was appropriate. She looked at him. Why? Because you put a note in it telling yourself to come back, he said. And you came back. He held her gaze. I thought someone should mark that. She looked down at the book, at the cover she'd looked at 3 years ago and decided she couldn't justify. At the note in her own handwriting, small and practical, the note of someone who believed they'd return when the time was right. Thank you, she said. You're welcome, he said. They stood in the bookshop aisle on a cold Saturday in November, two people who had arrived at something from a long way away, by a route neither of them had planned, through a quantity of trouble that most people would have found sufficient reason to take a different road. They had not taken a different road. They were here. She tucked the book under her arm. There's a coffee place down the block, she said. The good one, not a chain. I know which one. They have the right espresso ratio. I'll be the judge of that, he said. She walked toward the door. He followed. Outside, the November light came down thin and cold and real, and they walked down Clark Street together in it. Not quickly, not performing anything, just two people walking toward coffee on a Saturday, and the city moved around them the way cities move. Indifferent to individuals, indifferent to what they've been through, indifferent to what they're beginning, which was fine. They were not asking the city for anything. Months later, she would think about what the bookshop had contained before he bought the book. The note in her own handwriting, the price sticker, the slight lean of it against its neighbor on the bottom shelf, the accumulated weighting of an object that had been passed over enough times to stop expecting to be chosen. She would think about how long things sometimes waited to become what they were going to be. She would think about the morning after she'd found the 9-character code at 2 a.m., and the dinner where she'd invented a redundancy layer that didn't exist and watched a man come to the end of his overconfidence, and the Saturday on Clark Street, and all the ordinary mornings between and after, 2 cups of coffee, the same starting sequence, the work that needed doing, arriving in its regular increments and getting done. She was still at her desk at the end of the open floor plan, separated from the executive suite by the frosted glass partition. The desk was still large enough to hold 3 monitors and 4 filing systems, and the mug that said "World's Okayest Employee" that her cousin had given her as a joke, and the work still arrived in its regular increments and still got done. The difference was in what the work was, and what she was authorized to know, and whose door she could knock on to deliver information without being asked for it first. And one other difference, smaller, not announced, just present in the way that changes are present when they're real rather than performed. Every morning he came in, Minji stopped at her desk and took the espresso she'd already made and said whatever needed to be said about the day's operational picture. This had not changed. What had changed was that sometimes, in the pause between the espresso and the operational briefing, he used a name for her that he had not used before in 3 years, 2 months, and however many days she was no longer counting. Not her name. A different one. Small, private, said in the tone of someone who has decided a thing and is naming it. Sparrow, he said, the first time, without explaining it, and she had looked at him for a moment and then looked back at her monitors and said, "The Ancient Manifest is on your desk." And he had gone to his office, and that had been that. She knew why he'd chosen it. She'd thought about it afterward, quietly, at her desk. A sparrow was small and common and easy to overlook in a skyline full of larger birds. And it was also one of the only birds that consistently thrived in cities, in the built human world, in the concrete and noise and density, not despite the environment, but because of a particular quality of attention to it. Noticing which ledge held food, which awning offered cover, which window was reliably left open. She had not told him she knew why he'd chosen it. Some information you kept. Not because you were hiding it, but because it was yours, because you'd found it yourself, because the finding was the whole point. She kept the Cisneros on her desk, not on a shelf, not in a drawer, on the desk, in the small space between the second and third monitors where there was just enough room for a book to stand upright. Her note was still on the inside cover. She'd thought about whether to feel strange about that and decided she didn't. It was her handwriting. She'd been right to come back. Outside, Chicago moved through its seasons. The November cold, the long winter, the abrupt March that skipped gradually and went directly from freezing to the particular aggressive aliveness of a Midwestern spring, the summer heat coming off the pavement and the river both, the autumn again, cycling back. She noticed all of it. She always had. It had gotten her into trouble and out of it, and into something else entirely. She picked up her pen. She opened her notebook to a fresh page. The work arrived, as it always did, in its regular increments. She began.